Hello, everybody. With me today is Professor Christine Chinkin, who is Emerita Professor of International Law and Professional Research Fellow at the LSE. She's also the founding director of the Centre of Women's Peace and Security at the LSE. She's a barrister. She's won a medal for outstanding contribution to international human rights law and has so many different accolades that we're attaching a long biography to this video so that you can see all of them. Currently, she's a member of the Kosovo Human Rights Advisory Panel, and she was the scientific advisor to the Council of Europe's Committee for the drafting of the Convention on the Prevention of and Combating of Violence against Women and Domestic Violence. So an awful lot to talk about, Christine. Thank you for your time today and welcome. Can we start, Christine, just by asking you how you got involved in working in human rights and women's rights in particular?
Hello, and thank you, Davina, and it's great to be with you in this interview. That's a difficult question because it seems to be such a long time ago. And sort of working with, in and on women's human rights issues has really been very much part of my academic and non-academic life for at least now, probably 30 years or so. I'm an international lawyer primarily. I was working, teaching, researching, etc. in international law, and at the time when I was first working in that area, human rights was still quite an unusual area to specialize in. This is the late 70s, early 80s. While in Europe, the European Convention, of course, had been operative for quite some time, the United Nations human rights bodies were still very much in their infancy, were still really not very well known. So on the one hand, human rights was quite an exciting area to start working in. But then with colleagues, including Andrew Burns, who I know is involved with this, but other colleagues, particularly in Australia, we began thinking about, well, why is international law itself so gender blind and essentially a very masculine, both in substance and with those who were most involved in international law. Sort of where were the women in international law, I suppose, is really what it came down to. And so with two colleagues in universities in Australia, we began analysing international law from a feminist perspective. And through that work, various women's human rights organisations began to get in touch with us, began to see how our academic work could gel with, help progress, work with the more activist work that various women's NGOs were doing. And this was also especially at the time when the issue of violence against women, gender-based violence against women, was beginning to be an issue of major concern. And again, being able to think about, well, how does understanding violence against women as a human rights concern fit into a broader international legal framework was really, I think, the sort of entry point into working on women's human rights. And sort of from that, I think I've very much tried to see human rights, women's human rights as my major academic research area, but also then there's no point just researching women's human rights, has to have an activist agenda as well, and have to try to see how the two can come together. And equally then as a matter of legal practice. So the academic, the activist, and the practitioner sort of aspect, I think I've sort of tried to bring those together as much as possible.
Wow, that's amazing, Christine. So you were working on human rights at the very time that CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, was actually being put together by the UN. And that's when it was the same sort of time at the end of the 1970s, 1979, I think that first came into being. And I see your current research interests are still around gender, around post-conflict resolution, and also the application of that UN Convention of CEDAW by our own government. Could you tell us a little bit about that then, please, and about your involvement with CEDAW?
As you just said, so much of it all comes together in different ways. And yes, my current work is very much around women's human rights in conflict and post-conflict situations. And I think that there is perhaps a risk of people thinking about women's human rights as only being applicable in conflict, post-conflict situations. I think what's really important about CEDAW is that it's applicable to all women at all times. It's a universal women's convention. And especially important has been the move with respect to ensuring that gender-based violence against women is recognized as a violation of women's human rights, and the obligation upon states to prevent and combat violence against women, including violence that is committed by non-state actors, by partners, by men in the community, by other women, of course, or on some occasions, by militia, by a whole range of actors that commit such violence against women. So my work with CEDAW, again, I think has been very much across, as I was just saying, sort of the academic and the practitioner. On the one hand, I was one of the co-editors of the Oxford University Press commentary on the CEDAW Convention. And the commentary on the CEDAW Convention essentially provides an analysis of each of the provisions of the convention, how it came into being, what the provision addresses, how it has been developed by the Committee on Elimination Against Discrimination Against Women, so that it's become a major tool for people using the CEDAW Convention. And I think that has been a major part of my work. But then more explicitly, and you mentioned that I was involved in the drafting of the Council of Europe Convention on Violence Against Women. I worked with the CEDAW Committee on their general recommendation number 35 on violence against women, and how that general recommendation sets out very clearly states' obligations with respect to preventing, combating violence against women, where that fits within the overall human rights framework. And also I've been involved in preparing amicus briefs for the CEDAW committee, a case involving Spain, for example, where in fact the violence was committed against, it was a custody case that went very badly wrong, and the mother had been had experienced violence at the hands of her partner for a long time. There was separation. The children were on a custody visit. The mother insisted that this was not safe for the children, and the father indeed killed the children on an unsupervised access visit. And this case went to the CEDAW committee. I was involved in preparing an amicus brief for the committee for that, and also amicus briefs before, in particular, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and showing the Inter-American Court how CEDAW can and should be read in conjunction with the Inter-American Conventions relating to violence against women, all of which is part of trying to develop an overall approach to violence against women within human rights law, both at CEDAW itself, but more broadly at the various regional levels as well.
Thank you, Christine. That's actually very timely, isn't it? I mean, the book that you refer to, and we'll give a link to this for those who are watching, was actually referred to as a landmark treaty in the struggle for women's rights. But the work that you've been doing on violence, particularly with regard to domestic violence, has really come to the fore at the time of COVID, with so many women being locked up with their abusive partners.
Yeah.
And it is something that we need to be very mindful of these days, particularly as we don't seem to be coming out of this lockdown situation anytime soon. And it is the vulnerable who are most at risk for all aspects of COVID. And obviously, your work has been very instrumental in trying to help those women. I did note from what I've read about you that what you want to do is to make the world a better, safer place for women. And I'd just like you to say a few words how you think that the CEDAW People's Tribunal might actually help to bring that about.
Doesn't everybody want to make the world a safer place for everybody, but certainly for women? I mean, I think I think the important part of the an important part of the CEDAW Tribunal is obviously making CEDAW better known within this country and emphasising to the UK government that CEDAW is an international treaty, it has binding legal obligations, and that the government should be held to account for ensuring compliance with those legal obligations. And so that's at the governmental level. And for women, I think it is vital that women's rights are recognised as rights, that they are entitlement, and that every woman has the right to be free from violence, for example, to be free from all forms of discrimination, to use the title of the convention itself. And unfortunately, I don't think that the government has been, or successive governments, we became a party to CEDAW back in 1986, and yet successive governments have still failed to make the convention part of UK law, to make it something that those who are women who are discriminated against can use as a legal tool to hold the government to account, and in so doing, therefore also to make those same legal requirements applicable to all women. And behind every woman who is discriminated are a whole number of other women who are also being discriminated against. And I think what is important, I mean, I've been talking about violence in particular, and of course, the government should also become a party to the Istanbul Convention, as there was a commitment made to do so back in 2012. But the Istanbul Convention and CEDAW are a package. The Istanbul Convention was very much drafted with CEDAW completely in mind. There are provisions in the Istanbul Convention that replicate CEDAW precisely. General recommendation on violence against women by the CEDAW Committee pushes the Istanbul Convention further. So there's a package there, and the government should be mindful. Well, should ensure that those obligations are part of UK law, and I think that is really what we're talking about, and how that would help women and their children in this country to feel safer, to have appropriate recourse to the legal system.
That is exactly what we're trying to do, Christine, and we're delighted to have you on board and helping us in our work to make this country a better place for all women and girls. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.